So welcome, and great to see all of your faces. Those of you as far away as Taiwan, hey there, and Manila, or Philippines, not in Manila. So the talk we wanted to do tonight is really prompted by the fact that here we are, so long into this pandemic, and we've all kind of settled into it somewhat. And it was at the beginning of the pandemic when we started doing these talks. And so, maybe at the last talk even, we all thought, oh, we're moving out of it now. And then the Delta variant came along, and it's really changed the landscape once more. And what we're hearing from students all over, and what we actually are experiencing ourselves, is emotion. And that's hard for Richard to experience emotion. He doesn't like that. But it's what's up right now. So we started thinking about the idea of the transmutation of emotions, and how when the emotions are transmuted, what happens? And so when as we cover this evening, we put the subtitle as Steps Towards Freedom, because in fact, emotions arise as a response to something. We'll talk about what emotions are in a moment, but when we really learn how to work with emotions rather than stifling them or avoiding them, they can truly be powerful steps in our evolution towards freedom.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
I think just the word emotion is what makes you move or makes things happen. It makes the wheels go round.
And long ago, when I first took classes with Richard, actually back in the 80s, his flyer that was posted around town, the first line in the description was, "Yoga is freedom." And that's really what got me hooked in the idea of doing yoga. Although I haven't really figured out what you meant by that.
I haven't either, but quite difficult to explain. But initially, what's meant by freedom traditionally in yoga is you have this inner sense of satisfaction that's so deep or so profound. And inner is a metaphor. It could be, it's also inner and outer, and it's a sense of satisfaction that makes you free from having to have people approve of you or disapprove of you, or having to have a permanent body that never suffers birth, death, old age, and disease. And so that extreme and sometimes in our minds we get a little taste of it, but then the mind takes like a little photo of it, and then we can never quite re-find it. But it's that sense of what they would call the not your self and what you think self is, but what is really going on. And it doesn't have to, it's so nice that you're free, and you're also free to experience all of the fears and emotional pluses and minuses, but you don't have to push and pull them. And so it's a very sacred thing, freedom.
And feeling it in the body. You keep...
Oh yeah, why do I put my hand there?
Yeah.
It's like, because I'm looking. Well, because it's in yoga, it's associated with the central channel, and not just what we usually think of as the central channel, but it's the central channel of the central channel of the it's very rarely experienced, even by people who know the traditions very, very well. And so they call it the nectar channel. And it's so and it puts you into a state of actual freedom.
And it's a feeling really of tenderness in the core of the heart. This sense we speak sometimes in the practice of the heart floating and the heart being spacious and that things are heartfelt. And it's that, really wonderful feeling that we all have had, I think.
Yeah, I think we've all had tastes of it. And sometimes you would say it's wisdom, and sometimes you would say it's love. And it's a mixture of those things.
And so it's really not necessarily freedom from something.
Right, and of course, freedom is often, particularly in this country, they say, I want to be free, so I want to be free to tell lies about my neighbor. I want to be free to, drive on the wrong side of the street. I don't want anybody telling me what to do. And that's not what's meant in yoga by freedom at all.
Yeah.
And then the freedom also gives you the freedom to really work and do for others completely. And that's important.
And so then juxtaposing that with emotions, we wanted to define, well, what then do we mean by emotions? And I, thought we'd start with emotions from the psychological perspective. There's defined as sort of a complex state of feeling. So it is reference to feeling, to actually sensation in the body. And it's a complex state of feeling that results in physical and psychological changes that then impact our behavior and our thinking. And that's how, you might define it from a psychological perspective. And when you look at it psychologically and look at the studies that are done about emotion, different researchers sort of go off in different directions looking at, well, is it something neurologically based? Is it physically based? Is it mentally based? And really, as we look at it from the yogic perspective, the answer is yes, it's all of those. And much, much more. It is, in a sense, when emotions arise, they are these cues that we get telling us something is either out of balance or something is prominent in our circumstances or in our surroundings. So that they are cues when you have an emotion. And yet what happens, and the reason the idea of transmuting emotions is sort of sought after, is that as soon as emotions arise, very, very often we are swept into a stream of either habitual behavior or thinking behavior or, sort of habitual patterns of sensing and feeling, which might translate to something like depression or might translate to something like being a person who is consistently fearful of everything. So as soon as we get these cues that something is not quite right, and that's a real benefit of them, we very, very often grab onto a storyline to make them make sense, or we grab onto a habitual pattern, so that what can transpire is that if we just sort of fall prey to our emotions, a couple of things can kind of go wrong. One is that we can act them out, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we really have the tendency to see them, our emotions, and we think of this often when we think of transmuting them, meaning change them. We see them as objects. We objectify the emotion. And the instant we objectify anything, but in particular an emotion that has, its sort of hooks in our heart, in this place Richard was describing as freedom, the emotion can turn that freedom into sort of something that is not freedom whatsoever. And as soon as those hooks are in there deeply, and we've objectified the emotion, or we objectify the desire to get rid of the emotion, then we experience a sense of avidya, or of separateness, of mistaking that which is permanent, with something that is impermanent. And when you look closely at your day, and you look closely at any emotion, even if you are someone who suffers from emotional turmoil, and I personally have grappled over, as a child, I had depression, and then over the years, off and on, it has come and gone. And even when I'm in that state, if I am able to pull myself back enough, I can see that, emotions are not just an object like a car, even though it feels sometimes like you're being overwhelmed by them, but they're a pattern.
Yeah. Well, the metaphor of the car is ahamkar is the Sanskrit word for meaning I am my car. And particularly where we live in this entitled Boulder people, I am my Tesla car. And the car also refers to a yantra or a pattern, a sacred pattern, which is the body traditionally. And so oftentimes, the emotion that is, really dangerous is, of course, anger. But then that comes from what we think is sometimes positive, like, I've just figured out how I can become, super wealthy and, have my own spaceship.
Who would think of a thing like that?
I mean, that just came to me.
I don't know.
And, and then I get all excited, and I'm like all the time running around and smiling because I figured out these schemes. And that, and I feel that in the body too. And so the main thing, that insight that is, you feel it in your body. But the practice of yoga is a way of like really feeling it in all of its background shadows that we usually ignore. And so that's quite profound, is how to feel.
And as you start looking at different kinds of emotion, and you, when you tap into your own story, because most emotions have a story attached to them, like getting to outer space and coming back down after 2 seconds.
The idea is that most feelings or sensations in the body, they always start a storyline, or they reinforce a storyline. A good storyline or a bad storyline. They're all grounded in prana or sensation. And I think part of the difficulty is people, they look at prana, but then they have immediately this confusion where they have some kind of picture of it. And they don't realize that the picture of it is the story. And so they stop looking, and they wander off with their picture of what's going on. Even when you say, I'm going to transmute my emotions, they usually don't, by what we mean by transmute, doesn't mean to change or to get rid of them. But there's another meaning that we're going to try to tease apart in the next few minutes.
And so, in order to really transmute emotions, one of the things is to be able to look at the character of the different kinds of emotions that arise, like anger, which is one that, as a yoga teacher sometimes, and I've heard Richard say to students, anger is just an emotion, and learning to experience the full breadth of all of these emotions is an incredibly powerful and important thing. Anger is something that, when we're in a tamasic state, sometimes can be the one thing that shows us the way to actually benefit the situation, benefit others, because we become, fueled by this anger. If the anger is used well, but if the anger is turned out and projected onto others, or turned inward.
Oh, that's suffering. It's one of the gates to hell.
Yeah.
Is anger. And I think in the world today, there's plenty of it manifesting. And it's...
And so they're pure emotions, kind of like anger. And I think sadness really is another pure emotion in a sense. Although sadness is on this borderline where it starts to be more complex. And if you look at something like jealousy, and we're going to talk about sort of the enemies that surround the heart, and jealousy being one of them. Jealousy and grief, they're examples of very, very complex emotions that we may experience. So if you have anger, or if you have excitement or something like that, if you're in the throes of it, it's very hard to remember that it wasn't always like that. It's hard to remember when you're angry that you won't always be angry. But then something like jealousy has this complexity to it, because it is almost like two complementary opposite things going on, where you have a great deal of anger, and you also have desire. And so these are two emotions that are somewhat conflicting, that are both sort of being stimulated at the same time. And we were talking about in Shakespeare, in Othello, the great character there was, Iago had tried to make him jealous. And he described jealousy as the green-eyed
the green-eyed
monster, which is just an amazing description, of a kind of emotion that we feel, that it is, and emotions can turn into monsters in that way.
And I think everyone, saint or sinner, has experienced all of these emotions.
Yeah.
And does experience them probably many times a day. And so what to do. So that one point that you made at the beginning, the avidya, which means to be not to know. Vid is to know, and avidya means I don't know. And that's considered ignorance. And that's when you look at something or experience something and you reduce it to a story. And so you're not really seeing it in itself. Mm-hmm. And so you've reduced it, that is actually comes from this. And so you are not really paying attention. And you get the name of something confused with the thing itself, the nama and the rupa. And so this is what mind does. That's how the mind works. And so you're unable, even when you're looking at something that you've read about, or in a yoga text or tradition or religious text, this is a special thing, just really look at this, then we tend not to because of avidya. And so avidya is when you cease to see that everything is interpenetrating, a weaving, a texturing of infinity. And there's this misconception that there's a separate self.
And then we slip into what would be referred to as the small self, like you were talking about, the small mind, rather than the big self. And to access that freedom, that sense of, that unspeakable sense of spaciousness and joy in the core of the heart, that is not possible when you have cut yourself off from others. It is almost impossible not almost, it is impossible to truly be absorbed by that kind of feeling in isolation.
Yeah. You can get absorbed in things, but you're not getting absorbed in, the nicest part of yoga. And that's too bad.
And then we were, thinking of, from the yogic perspective and the Buddhist perspective too, very often this idea that all of these emotions are good, and they are cues telling us that something is up that we need to pay attention to. And although and all these myths and things have the stories of people, with knee-jerk reactions responding to their emotions. But if we can sit with them and observe them, that's where the value starts to come about. And part of what really starts to make us see that is an appreciation for Indian and Buddhist art and some of the beautiful depictions of different emotions.
And
looking to see what Donka we have behind us. Is there a demon back there?
No.
Is it?
She's very nice.
Yeah, in this form, yeah. In most forms.
And so we do different practices. So yoga practices are funny things. And of course, if you study the Yoga Sutra, which as homework you should all memorize, even tonight, that we're actually taking this silliness of the mind to be religious, or to say this thing is separate from that and this is much more important than that, which you do naturally as a living organism. You have to, otherwise you wouldn't survive a day on the street. And so part of our mental functioning is to say, oh, this is really important, I'll pay attention to it. And so this is the foundation of what we call religious life, even if you're, or metaphysical life, where you don't have to have any kind of a belief in a deity or something, but it's what we do. Even if we're dealing with a tradition where we say, say a Buddhist will say, oh, emptiness is where it's at. I think I'm going to go worship emptiness. And any idea of that in your mind is like, but you do it anyway. What's almost embarrassing in yoga is how, what's the word, silly, meaning empty in Middle English, is silly means empty, but it also means stupid, humorously. And so what we do is we create an image. It could be a mantra, or I love, in the terms of emotional transmutation, the images that have appeared in a lot of the artwork, where you might have a deity form, say, of Kali, who is the fearful goddess, and she's the goddess that represents death and impermanence, and and nobody wants to deal with Kali. They want to go and deal with
Tara.
Tara, or Lalita,
Lakshmi,
or Lakshmi, or something pretty, and which is, I totally understand. Me too. But the nature of the art is, what's happening is they're suggesting to your body, and a lot of it is a transmission that you don't really, in which the fearful goddess or the happy goddess or the god or the deity or the person or the bodhisattva, the Buddha, is experiencing extreme emotion, but they have excellent posture as they do it. And I'm thinking of Bharatnatyam, which is classical Indian dance, which is one of the earliest things where in art forms they would, in expressing of the dance, they would do all of these beautiful gestures and movements, but in such a way that all of the channels were being expressed as open. And so one would have this great sense of dignity, but at the same time be emotive. And so this is true of, the more complex art forms of, exposed in these early, technically tantric forms, but also within musical forms. Say, your religion doesn't allow you to visualize, but you still have the musical forms or the mantric form in which a particular word is empowered to mean this inexpressible freedom, this inexpressible joy, rather than what the word might normally mean. And so this is why a lot of mantras, you have to be introduced to them. They say initiated, but it just means, but we all have a lot of mantras from childhood, songs that really we enjoy. And we're not really, and it means something wonderful. And so
when you see these forms like Kali or, some of the demonic, what are sometimes called the demonic forms or the sort of intense forms, they are the reminder that those are really important aspects that balance out how you are in the world, if you are not just spewing them out onto others or pushing them out into the world. Kali becomes a very different character if she is, just indiscriminately going around, as a mass murderer, which is...
which a lot of people in their philosophies interpret time or reality to be a mass murderer. I mean,
it is kind of in its own strange way.
Kind of slow way we think, and this, of course, is the study of the Gita, okay. Yeah. But, and that's really the story and the emotion that is observed deep inside of that, the attachment to that story and the belief in that story. And so I'm just thinking of some of my favorite art pieces. I won't bring that over, but okay. I end up looking at this every morning, and it's a demonic. It's not demonic. It's anyway. It's a deity form with 3 eyes, and you know the gesture. It's like, and if you really do it well, your tongue is going into your palate, your perineum contracts, mulabandha, and you really feel in your body, but it's in a balanced middle pathway. The heat of the anger is just like pure rage, but there's no object. It's just, I'm totally angry, but I'm not angry at anybody. Not even myself, because that's the whole phase you go through. Oh, everybody else, I'm the worst. I hate me more than anything. But no, and this is a way of transmutation.
Yeah, and these practices like the lion pose, when you stick your tongue out and yeah.
And you roar. And the idea of doing the singhasana, or the lion, you got to keep, as you're exhaling, when you first inhale, you really feel I'm strong like a lion. But if you keep good posture, so you got to keep your heart open. You don't want to scare anybody, you know. And so but the more empty you get, and you want to make it a long roar, like it can go on for maybe a minute of terrible roar. By the time you're really empty, but your heart is still open, at the end of the exhale will begin make the pelvic floor, and then all of a sudden the whole story flips, and you feel like the little mouse that the lion was roaring at.
Yeah.
And you see the interconnection between the two, and you don't mind being, because you see that they're
And that's the whole
Vintage.
that's the whole benefit of it, is that the residue that you get from, and that's true for most practices, the residue rather than the practice itself. That's a good thing. But so often it's resting in that
yeah.
residue.
Yeah, and the residue is what, if you just try to change emotions or get rid of emotions, which is what most of us do, because everybody wants to, like, well, I got to feel better. I'm going to go do this or that. There's always a residue because you're not really becoming aware of or the subject or the assumptions that your story has made, and you're not looking and asking questions, and so it's kind of sad. Should we do the 6?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Go
So
for it.
we've done this one before. The Shat Ripu, which just means the 6 enemies, and they're often referred to as internal enemies because we again like to locate that. And they are first the 3 gates to hell: Kama, Krodha, and Lobha. And this is in visualization of the heart chakra, a downward-facing triangle. And so Kama just means desire, and it could mean desire in the sense of lust, or it could mean just I want that, And it could be a pizza. It could be.
We shouldn't do these near dinner time so often.
And any sense object that you contemplate, if that often happens, people will early in the day offer me, like, are you interested in a espresso, decaf, of course, and
Not people, person.
yeah, so this person, and hadn't thought about it, but then as you think about it, then you think, then an attachment develops for that, because you're feeling the story of, and you're remembering all that. So much of the pleasure that is imaginary, when we eat or something, because the actual taste is gone. But, for hours beforehand, I'm thinking, when I get there, I'm going to eat this or that. And so that's kama that's more in the harmless sense, but it could be a desire for any kind of satisfaction.
And again, that separates. I mean, that's the big theme in all of these emotions,
I
is
need
that
that.
I need this, period, and everyone else doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I have to get you your coffee before you go into that mode every morning.
Oh, no, now it's morning in some parts
It is
of the
morning
world.
with kindness.
And but then krodha is when there's a blockage, and it's really the same storyline, but it's like, and then it's just anger, and this just raw anger is, of course, a very, you really feel it physically, and no one will deny that. And then kama, krodha, lobha is, what's lobha? Greed. Okay, so greed is an extension of which, I've gotten I want more of the things that I want, and
I've
greed
gotten
could
primary series. I have to get
I
second.
need 3rd series, 4th series. Now I need to be enlightened. I could be greedy, because if I get enlightened, then I'll get more followers, and people will pay me more money. And so that greed extends all the way to the point where I want to have my own universe. And then if I get my own universe, which we all kind of have our own separate strange, then I want to take over and I want to rule the planet Earth. And then I want to rule, the solar system. And then how about the Milky Way? And as we're learning through astronomy, Milky Way is only one of billions.
Yeah.
I want them all. And there are actually people, once you get a billion, what's wrong with a trillion? Once you get a trillion. And so there's actually no end to that. And it's miserable.
Yeah.
And then in the heart, there's another 3. And the next one is called moha. And moha just means delusion. And moha has the sense of, one is I start to think that things are the stories I've reduced them to, or the name, like you get nama and rupa, and that's basic ignorance. But delusion is also where you are extremely believing something about the world that you see around you that does not correspond to reality. And so I can be totally delusional, and I'll be talking to a lamppost on the street because my eyes are not as good as they used to be, and I thought it was a person, I misperceive, a bus, and I think a bus on the street is actually a cow. Those are delusions. And
then you have constructions of mind that are delusions, that are tied into things like greed and anger and lust.
Oh.
So your delusions can become quite complex. When
like certain conspiracy theories that a lot of politicians in many, many countries who they spread misinformation often through social media in order to create these extreme delusions, which are sad.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, often in those delusions, other beings are, they love to make an enemy. Okay, the problem is those people, or that country, or those people, or that class of person. That's the real problem, and so that's delusional. And then the next one, after the delusion, is madha, which means basically me. Me. And this is the kind of me first. It's a kind of narcissism that really starts to sprout. And in that narcissism, other people, of course, are reduced just to, if they flatter me or if they fall into my scheme. But if they don't, they're absolutely useless. And so me, I, me, and mine. And throughout the day, notice how many of your thoughts are kind of filled with I, me, and mine, which is natural. And remember that this is the way the mind, everyone's mind, works. It's just what are you paying in relationship to other beings?
Yeah, and in terms of actual, specific emotions, the next time you are filled with emotion, think of, if you happen to be able to, notice how much of it is me.
Poor
because emotions are really dovetail with that one in particular, and all of these, we go into delusions and we may become angry or lustful or whatever, but this is a big one with emotions, and it is that because they are generated from me,
which
the
is
me, and that's
biologically
good. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's just then, like we said at the beginning, immediately we click into habitual patterns with them and they become objectified.
And it can become really miserable
Yeah.
for many people.
Yeah.
So then the next one is called Matsaya, which is, Mat again is referring to me, but everything should flow to me. And so this is where one develops a kind of narcissism, a kind of specialness. What's the word I'm looking for?
I don't know.
Vanity.
Oh, vanity.
Yeah. And this can be also a way of, and vanity always has to do with what other people are, and you want other people to bow down to you. And it could be you just want them to think you're beautiful, or you want them to think that you're powerful, or you want them to think you're enlightened, or you want them to think you're God, or you want them to think that you're this or that. And Matsaya, it all flows to me. So this is again the extreme of narcissism.
And this is, back to the beginning when Richard was talking about freedom, and freedom from the need of approval from others is a big part of how we, really live in that part of our bodies and our minds. And so these 6 enemies, you might call them, that surround the heart really make it very, very difficult for that spaciousness and that tenderness and that freedom and the open-heartedness to truly be something that we viscerally can experience.
Yeah. And so the practice of, say, pranayama, which of course, we're very generous. If someone just makes a noise with their breath and slows down, like we say, that's pretty good pranayama. But it's actually a practice that is to be cultivated lifetime after lifetime traditionally. It might take 1 billion lifetimes, which is pretty fast, considering the work that has to be done. But what happens is at the heart level, if you're able to, through pranayama, clean out the nadis, nadi shodhana, then you start to actually experience the transmutation of emotion. Because what happens is, in my body, I hold all other beings, at least my theory about them. I don't actually hold them. We hold each other, but if I think that, even if I think, and this is the classic example you probably heard, if I think someone is not a good person, and there are actually people who need a little bit of encouragement and becoming nice, I tend to place them in a place in my body other than my heart. And there might be people like that you think of your own examples. I tend to think of too many people that way. But as long as a being is, then it's being associated with a particular flow of sensation through the entire body. And if I'm actually doing the pranayama, and I am able to feel that sensation without reducing it, without going off on the story, and that's the challenge right there, then I start to feel the balance start to occur in the body, in which the 6 enemies are actually balanced. And I start to feel, this whole part of my body was closed down because I was holding this being there. They don't even have to be human beings. You could, if you're mad at horses and cows and just, and you'll put them in a different part of your body, or even crows and snakes and insects, even mosquitoes even. And so, and by feeling the opposite, then you're feeling the almost what it's like to be them. And you're feeling is, oh, now I feel what it's like to be them and what it's like to be me. And if I feel them at the same time, they appear in the heart, and it doesn't make them good or bad, but it just means that, oh, now I have that freedom where I have that satisfaction of actually loving them or feeling compassion for them.
And in a sense, it's a similar thing that happens in the visualizations that are associated with art, where we see, these extreme emotions being shown in some of this Indian and Buddhist art. And, it brings up in us something that then we counterbalance. Through the practice, by being grounded through the practice, we can then absorb something like that without acting on it and without it overly influencing us in a negative way. And in fact, the visualizations, or what Richard was just talking about with the prana, they then become the pathways that we can find intricate ways of change and insight in the world, because that we wouldn't have been able to had we not had the full spectrum experience.
Yeah, in which we see all of those things that's us. All those things that are scary, and all the the glorious stories are dependent on the inglorious stories, and so we're able then to experience. So if the sensation itself, not as or as we're saying, you're experiencing prana or sensation as this indescribable, irreducible, what any word you choose, you've got to then go back and be mindful that the word could then create a thing. So if I say, oh, it's the Tao, well, oh, what do you mean by that? But then you start to see, oh, the word itself, even if the word is a deity or a mantra or emptiness, or that word itself is also to be observed without reducing it. And so this is the practice of mindfulness, smritya, or
And applying that, so we've talked about applying it through the asana practice, through the pranayama practice, through the meditation practice, and then letting those that freedom that one gets and experiences, maybe just a taste of through those practices, letting that spill out into everyday life when we do have emotions arise, because even those wonderful yogis who've practiced for hundreds and hundreds of lifetimes experience emotions, sometimes dysregulating emotions that, and if the trick that starts to come to our benefit is that, or be beneficial for us, is being able to say, wait a minute, this is not something that's separate from me. It's not something that separates me from other things. And it is something that is a cue. And if I pause and step back and really check into the plumb line, check into the sensations along the core of the body, then I can get grounded enough to get perspective, to have perspective shifting, see the storyline possibly that is sort of the impetus for this emotion, and set the whole thing down, and give it, attentiveness without running away with it and without projecting it and without stifling ourselves with it. And so it becomes this practice of mindfulness. And we can't always do that when we're in the throes of emotion. And that's just the way it is. But the more we practice it in little ways or in big ways through our practices, on the cushion or in the chanting or meditation or whatever, pranayama, then the easier it is for that sort of technique to spill out into the practical world of day-to-day irritation with the person who cuts you off in traffic or something like that. And then you do the little things, where you see they're suffering too. And so very often with our emotions, what we can, the real savings and the real transmutation that starts to happen is that we see interconnectedness. And not only do we theorize it, but it's like you were just saying,
We
where
feel,
we
yeah,
feel
you feel it through all the senses. Because sometimes, they say, oh, I see it, but that could be too visual. I can hear it, or I touch it, in the skin. And so this is why sometimes a lot of the practices that have to do with pranayama are where you go through all of the different types of, all the different levels of sensation in the body, which corresponds to what they call the chakras. So you're going through, and this way you're starting to, understand. And then you have to be careful with whatever you call it. I mean, the name itself is also sacred, that you're calling it, but don't get it confused.
Because when you fall into that trap of defining it to a point that you've called it something that you can't let go of and that has limited it, where's the freedom in that? So that really what we're looking at when we're talking about transmuting emotions is not looking at them as an object and then changing that object, but looking at them as a pattern of something that is arising that we may be able to embrace in a way that allows transformation. Transformation both of the intensity of the emotion, but also transformation of mind and circumstance and all of that.
And then through that art, you're able to actually begin communicating. Okay, and so that of course then makes people, they start to learn that the art of yoga is through communication, through inquiry, and it breaks down the sectarian and religious divides gradually. And so pretty much we got to start. And people have actually been doing these traditions of yoga in many cultures around the world for thousands of years. And so there are, there's a lot of knowledge, but to access it, one has to really inquire, to study, to ask questions, and then communicate. And then they go, wow. And I think there's hope.
Yeah.
Not very much, but there's
there's a lot of
Oh, there's a lot. Okay.
And it's really dependent on showing up. And, we say this over and over, showing up and doing the practice, and that doesn't mean necessarily rolling out your yoga mat and doing primary series or, sitting on the cushion and holding your holding your breath for 5 minutes at a time in pranayama. What it really means is treating your practices as really sacred parts of sort of tilling the soil of your existence, so that you have this garden of soil that you are, sort of working and turning and dealing with, in which you actually grow, and where things that come into your garden or whatever, that's getting a little hokey there, but that they grow. So it starts to become this interconnected thing, which is very dependent on the communication. And when we are trapped with the me, in my emotions, it's impossible to really communicate well.
Yeah, it's impossible to nourish
And to,
the environment, which is all
Yeah.
other beings.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking of that Trambakam Yajamahe,
Yeah.
that it's about Shiva who has
Yeah.
3 eyes, but who's also a masterful cultivator of, it turns out, pumpkins and cucumbers, but he has good taste, Sugandhim. He has this sense of like the delight of just a good smell, which will also put you open, that'll open your central channel if you get the right and you naturally share that with others. But then and then he has the art of, through that skill of like in dealing with the environment, the entire environment, he raises other beings, like, and eventually they're like pumpkins, or that are time to pluck from the vine. It's like giving birth, and so it's nice chant.
Yeah. Do you want to chant it? Anne,
Oh.
or no?
I could, if I can remember. Trambakam yajamahe sugandhim pushtipardhanam. What's the name? Urvarukam iva bandhanam mrityo mukshiyamamritata. And so this is, look that chant up.
Yeah.
Trambakam. It's very famous. People will chant it as a mantra,
So when emotions have you in their grip, use the idea of pausing and just dropping into the body, and using these practices of feeling the prana, of feeling that sense of spaciousness and open, really tenderness in the core of the heart. And when the emotions are overwhelming, it may be difficult to do that. You may need to, have someone help you. But you also may be able to sort of summon the notion of, well, what's at stake here? If I continue to be caught on this wheel of samsara and be caught in this sort of pattern of suffering, the kleshas, where I've separated myself from everything else. And with that awareness, sometimes it is just enough when we paused to be able to shift. And it may not be a big shift. It's not like, oh, well, then you just throw your anger away, but you say, what is really the point of this? What is the story, and how can I set this down so that I can really show up for what's here? And that's the way, transmutation of emotion becomes a connection to freedom, because you have freed yourself and you've freed others as well.
Yeah, and that connection is what freedom is to everything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And we'll stop the recording, but for those, if anyone sticks around and has questions, we're happy to answer. So we'll see you next time.